What if the most powerful thing you could say was nothing at all? In a world that glorifies relentless expression, where value is often measured by visibility and authenticity is confused with emotional exhibition, one ancient force is quietly being forgotten: the sacred power of silence. But not just any silence, strategic silence, not as a form of manipulation, but as a path to self-possession. A silence rooted in self-knowledge, in depth, in the vast and often uncharted territory Carl Jung called the unconscious. Unlike the performative world of political cunning where Niccolo Machiavelli once reigned, Carl Jung looked inward. He wasn't concerned with how to dominate others through clever concealment. He wanted to understand the hidden forces within us, the complexes, shadows, archetypes, and projections that shape not just what we do, but who we are. And that's where this new form of silence emerges, not from a need to control others, but from the profound need to understand and master the self. Because in Jungian psychology, silence isn't passive. It's the field where the self begins to speak. To survive in the world, we wear masks. Jung called this the persona, the version of ourselves shaped to be socially acceptable. The persona communicates constantly. It performs, adjusts, reacts, apologizes, explains, and seeks approval. But here's the paradox: the more we speak from the persona, the less we hear from the self, the deeper, truer identity buried beneath social conditioning. Silence, when chosen with awareness, is the act of stepping back from the performance. It is the sacred pause that allows us to notice, where am I speaking from? Who is truly doing the talking? The world urges you to constantly externalize, to project your thoughts, opinions, and inner state at every moment. But Jung understood that what is not first integrated internally will inevitably be projected externally, often in ways we don't realize. And projection is the enemy of authenticity. Only silence breaks the loop. According to Jung, the shadow is everything within us we reject, suppress, or deny. It's the dark twin of our persona. The parts we refuse to acknowledge, yet which still shape our behavior from behind the curtain of consciousness. And often our compulsive need to speak is not strength, it is shadow defense. We speak quickly to avoid vulnerability. We overshare because we fear being misunderstood. We explain ourselves endlessly because we are trying to convince others of a truth we haven't fully accepted ourselves. But Jung would argue, if you cannot tolerate silence, it is not the world you fear. It is your own psyche. Let's be clear, this is not about emotional repression or spiritual bypassing. Jung's work was not about becoming impassive or numb. He believed in the integration of opposites, not the denial of emotion, but its containment and transformation. To practice silence in the Jungian sense is to withdraw from reactive expression and instead turn inward, asking, what part of me is speaking right now? Am I reacting from a wound, a complex, a fear of rejection? Is my voice serving my individuation, or just echoing the noise of the collective? When you sit in silence, not avoidance, but conscious stillness, you begin to feel the stirrings of the unconscious. You begin to notice what you normally suppress: anxiety, anger, sadness, insight, intuition. This is where inner alchemy begins, because silence is not emptiness, it is the container that allows the transformation of the psyche to unfold. Jung described individuation as the process of becoming whole, of uniting the conscious with the unconscious, the ego with the self. It is not about becoming someone else. It's about becoming who you already are, beneath the noise. An individuation requires space, inner space. If you're always speaking, you're always reinforcing the ego's narrative. You're always explaining, adjusting, reacting. But the deeper, a voice within you, the one that speaks not with words but with images, dreams, and intuition, needs quiet to emerge. This is why Jungian silence isn't passive. It's the active withdrawal of energy from performance and its redirection inward. True growth, he said, comes not from addition, but from integration, and integration requires stillness. There is also a protective layer to this type of silence, what Jung would associate with psychic boundaries. When you overshare your process, when you expose your pain or dreams too quickly, you risk polluting your inner work with external noise. You become too concerned with how others perceive your growth, rather than how it actually feels. You begin to perform your healing instead of living it. You let your individuation be seen before it is rooted and it withers. Jung often warned that individuation is not a collective process. It is a deeply personal, sacred journey and must be treated with reverence. Not everything is meant to be spoken. Not every truth is meant to be tweeted. Not every dream is meant to be dissected. Some truths gain power by being held, not explained. One of Jung's most powerful insights was that people rarely see you as you are. They see what they unconsciously project onto you. And when you remain quiet, when you allow space, they reveal more about themselves than you do. This is the art of holding psychological space. Just like a mirror, silence reflects. And in that reflection, people show you their wounds, their fantasies, their fears. Without saying a word, you gain data, not to manipulate, but to understand the terrain you are navigating. This is not cold strategy. This is depth psychology in practice. In a society that moves at the speed of expression, where silence is often mistaken for ignorance, hesitation, or even guilt, the act of withholding words can seem counterintuitive. And yet, it is in this silence that the most meaningful psychological movement takes place. Carl Jung understood something many still overlook, that there is a kind of wisdom that does not need to speak, and a kind of presence that grows more powerful the less it demands. To be seen. Strategic silence, when examined through the lens of depth psychology, is not a performance to impress others, but a commitment to remain in relationship with one's own inner world before rushing to engage the outer one. For Jung, everything begins within. The external world is merely a mirror, often distorted, of the psychic forces that govern our perception and behavior. The way we speak, the urgency with which we share, the ease with which we disclose thoughts and emotions, these are not neutral acts, they are clues. Clues about how well we know ourselves, how safe we feel inside our own psyche, how desperate we are to be seen, validated, or accepted. Most people do not realize this, but many of the words we utter do not come from the center of our being. They come from complexes, from fears, from inherited patterns. They are echoes, not truths. This is why silence is so confronting for the modern ego. It removes the shield of language. Without words to hide behind, we are faced with the rawness of our own inner experience, the discomfort, the tension, the questions we've been avoiding. To choose silence is to choose to sit in that space, to allow the unconscious to rise without immediately framing, controlling, or explaining it. It is to welcome the unknown instead of fleeing from it with noise. But silence is not only introspective, it is also relational. The silent individual does not just connect more deeply with the self, they also shift the psychological dynamic in every interaction. Jung understood that people do not relate to one another directly. They relate through projections, through archetypes, through unconscious assumptions. And silence, when used with presence and purpose, has the uncanny power to interrupt these projections and destabilize habitual roles. When you do not speak to fit expectations, others are forced to reconsider their script. When you do not rush to fill the space, they are left with themselves, and that can be disarming. This is why silence is not weakness, it is psychological authority. not in the Machiavellian sense of dominance through manipulation, but in the Jungian sense of presence rooted in integration. The more someone has integrated their shadow, the disowned, rejected parts of themselves, the less reactive they become. They no longer need to defend a fragile persona, nor to explain every decision or justify every thought. They are not performing for approval. They are not hiding behind noise. They are standing in themselves, and it is that inner stillness that others feel, even if they cannot explain it. It is what creates the sense of mystique that surrounds individuals who speak rarely but deliberately. Their silence is not empty. It is dense with meaning. It activates something archetypal, perhaps the image of the wise old man or woman, the sage, the oracle, the inner guide. In a culture saturated with speech, the one who speaks least often commands the most attention, not because they withhold for power's sake, but because they are in touch with something deeper than power. Jung believed that every psychological transformation begins with descent, the symbolic journey downward into the unconscious. And this descent cannot happen in the noise. It requires quiet. It requires stillness. It requires waiting in the dark until something begins to stir. The ego hates this. It wants to act, to speak, to control, but the soul requires patience. The unconscious does not shout. It whispers, and only the silent can hear it. Many of the greatest mistakes in life are made by those who speak before they are clear, act before they are grounded, or react before they have reflected. Silence is what breaks that chain. It is the interruption that allows a new choice to emerge. In negotiations, it prevents premature concessions. In conflict, it allows emotions to cool and clarity to rise. In relationships, it stops the cycle of projection and opens the door to genuine connection. But more importantly, in the life of the individual, it becomes the very space where the ego dies and the self begins to take shape. To understand this is to understand that silence is not passive, it is active containment. Jung warned of the danger of identifying with the persona, of becoming so attached to the outer mask that we forget there is a deeper, fuller being beneath it. When we speak compulsively, we feed that mask. We reinforce the idea that we are what? We say that our thoughts are who we are, that our feelings must always be aired to be valid. But sometimes the most powerful act is to hold the feeling without speaking it, to know the thought without expressing it, to see the desire and not act on it. That is where real psychological strength is born. This restraint is not repression. Repression is unconscious. It pushes things away blindly. Containment is conscious. It says, I see you, I'm not afraid of you, but I will not let you run the show. The difference between a reactive life and a conscious life is found in that moment. The pause between impulse and action, the breath taken in silence. It is the very space where transformation is seeded. We live in a time that demands immediacy, instant reactions, instant opinions, instant sharing. But Jung's work reminds us that the soul does not operate on the timeline of the internet. It is slow, symbolic, cyclical, and if we want to become who we truly are, not who we've been told to be, we must reclaim the silence that modern life has stolen from us. The silence that allows us to listen, not just to others, but to the forgotten voices within. The silence that creates space, not just for answers, but for deeper questions. And in that silence, something shifts. We no longer speak to convince, but to contribute. We no longer fear being misunderstood because we no longer seek approval. We no longer explain every step of our process because we know the value of what is becoming within us. We become selective, not out of pride, but out of reverence. Reverence for the mystery of our own becoming. Jung often said that the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent. But perhaps in our generation, the greatest burden is the unreflected life, the life spoken too quickly. lived too loudly, scattered across too many platforms to ever come home to itself. Silence is how we come home. To be silent is not to disappear. It is to return to the self, to the soul, to the place where all true transformation begins. There is a kind of silence that doesn't signal absence, but presence. Not emptiness, but fullness. Not confusion, but depth. It is the silence of someone who has met themselves fully and no longer needs to prove anything to anyone. In a world where most people speak to gain attention, the one who remains still becomes the center of gravity, not because they demand it, but because they no longer chase it. This is the energy Jung described when he spoke of individuation, not the pursuit of perfection or power, but the inner journey that leads to integration, to the becoming of a whole human being. And this journey is most often marked not by louder declarations, but by quieter strength. In Jung's view, power does not arise from dominance, but from alignment. A person who has integrated their unconscious no longer acts out of compulsion. They no longer need to be the loudest voice in the room because their presence already speaks. They carry within them the authority that comes from having faced their own darkness and not turned away. And when such a person chooses silence, that silence vibrates at a different frequency. It holds tension, weight, and mystery. There's a reason why silence can make others uneasy. Not because it's hostile, but because it disrupts the usual game of social reassurance. Most conversations are performances, exchanges of information, yes, but also unconscious rituals of validation. When someone doesn't play along, doesn't offer the expected response, doesn't speak on cue, the rhythm is broken. Something ancient is triggered. Projection begins. People start to fill in the blanks. They wonder what you're thinking, why you're holding back, what you're hiding, or perhaps what you already know. This is not manipulation. It's the natural psychological effect of unfulfilled expectation, and it's a phenomenon Jung understood deeply. Jung's work centered around archetypes, the universal symbols and patterns of human behavior that live within the collective unconscious. Some of these archetypes, like the sage, the magician, or the hermit, are inherently associated with silence. These figures do not reveal themselves easily. They observe, they reflect, they guard knowledge until the right moment comes, and precisely because they are not always speaking, they command reverence. Their words, when spoken, carry weight, not because of what is said, but because of the space from which the words emerge, a silence that has been filled with insight, not emptiness. This is where power shifts from external control to internal gravity. The individual who speaks constantly disperses their energy outward. The one who speaks sparingly contains it, concentrates it, and in that concentration, something alchemical happens. Their presence becomes magnetic. Their words, rare as they may be, are felt more deeply. They are not just communicating ideas, they are transmitting a state of being. That's the real power of psychological silence. It activates something deeper in others, often without intention. This kind of influence is radically different from manipulation. Manipulation seeks to control others through distortion. Jungian presence seeks to know oneself so fully that others are freed or challenged to do the same. Silence in this context is not a tactic, but a natural byproduct of inner coherence. It is what emerges when the ego no longer has the need to constantly assert its worth. But this silence can also be protective. In a world that demands performance and confession, strategic quiet becomes an act of sovereignty. You no longer need to explain yourself to be understood. You no longer need to share your process to prove you're evolving. You no longer need to narrate your healing, your vision, your goals to be taken seriously. You hold those things inward, not out of secrecy, but out of respect for the sacredness of your own transformation. This doesn't mean withdrawal from life. Jung was never in favor of passive detachment. Individuation is not a retreat, it's a return. But it is a return from illusion, from unconscious projections, from the collective need to be seen in order to exist. You begin to understand that true being does not depend on visibility, it depends on integration. And once you've tasted that state of being, you start to see the futility in trying to constantly explain yourself to those who haven't met their own depths. Silence then becomes a threshold, the place where the outer world stops and the inner world begins. And when you speak again, if you speak again, it is from a different place, a place not contaminated by urgency or fear or the desire to be liked. Your words come from a silence that has been mined for truth, a silence that has been held long enough to distill clarity. That's why when people who've done deep psychological work speak, they seem to say so much with so little, because the words are no longer fillers, they are vessels. This dynamic plays out everywhere, in leadership, relationships, negotiations, creativity. The person who is not reactive, who listens without rushing to speak, who holds the tension of ambiguity without collapsing into explanations, will always carry a kind of quiet power that those still ruled by the need for validation do not understand. And because it is so rare in modern culture, it is often misunderstood. Some see it as arrogance, others as aloofness. But for those who recognize it, it is unmistakable. This is someone who has met themselves. This kind of presence invites others to slow down, to go inward, to feel the silence not as absence, but as invitation. It is in this space that real relationships can be built, not ones based on projection or mutual performance, but on mutual recognition. A shared sense that something deeper is possible when we no longer fear what arises in the stillness. Carl Jung once said that loneliness does not come from being alone, but from being unable to communicate the things that matter most. And perhaps that is why so many speak so often, trying, without success, to bridge a gap that only presence can cross. The irony is that when one has truly met their inner world, they no longer speak to escape it. They speak or remain silent, from choice. And that choice changes everything. The person who chooses silence when noise is expected, who contains their energy when others are broadcasting theirs, who listens to the unconscious before responding to the world, that person is not just different. They are dangerous, not in the Machiavellian sense, but in the mythic sense. They are not predictable. They are not easily moved. They no longer play the game. And in not playing it, they change its rules. This is the mystery that commands respect, not because it demands it, but because it doesn't need to. In the modern world, where noise has become a form of identity and speed a measure of value, choosing silence is an act of rebellion. Not a rebellion of chaos or violence, but of depth, because to choose silence today is to withdraw energy from the machinery of performance, to reject the demand for constant output, and instead turn toward the slow, sacred work of self-knowledge. It is to remember that the soul does not speak in slogans, and the self does not rise in a rush. Carl Jung understood that the true journey of transformation does not begin when you speak. It begins when you listen. Not to others, not to the news, not to the crowd, but to what stirs in the depths of your own being. And for most, that voice has been buried for years beneath layers of adaptation, conformity, and noise. What is most real in us has been silenced by the constant need to be heard, and so to stop speaking, even for a while, is to begin hearing again. This is not easy, because silence, when practiced intentionally, brings everything to the surface. The unprocessed grief, the ancient fear, the voices of our ancestors whispering through dreams, the longings we abandoned for approval, the shadows we hid behind achievement. Most people never make it past this first threshold. They break the silence before it can bear fruit. They fill the space before it can teach. They retreat to words because silence begins to expose what the persona was built to protect. But Jung taught that the only way to wholeness is through confrontation with the unconscious. The material we repress does not disappear. It waits. It watches. It surfaces in our relationships, our reactions, our addictions, our sleepless nights. It doesn't want to be punished. It wants to be seen, and silence creates the space for that seeing. It is the crucible where the unspoken is finally allowed to speak, not with words, but with images, emotions, somatic language, the language of the soul. This is why the discipline of silence is not about retreating from life, but about returning to it from a place of inner alignment. Most people speak to control outcomes. They explain to avoid judgment. They share to be chosen. But once you realize that everything you try to protect externally stems from something unresolved internally, the game changes. You no longer speak to avoid being misunderstood. You become more interested in understanding yourself, and the more you understand yourself, the less others' misunderstanding can harm you. You begin to trust the timing of your expression. You no longer reveal your plans out of excitement or anxiety. You hold them until they have matured, until they can stand on their own. You speak your truth not because you are desperate to be heard, but because silence has shaped that truth into something clear, sharp, and alive. It is no longer a reaction, it is a revelation. This is the paradox. The more deeply you cultivate silence, the more powerful your words become. Not because you've learned to manipulate, but because your words now carry the vibration of someone who has nothing to prove. You are not here to convince. You are not here to win. You are here to embody. And embodiment cannot be argued with. It cannot be dismissed because it doesn't exist in theory. It radiates. In this space, influence becomes something entirely different. It is no longer about controlling narratives or persuading others. It becomes magnetic, archetypal. Others begin to respond not to what you say, but to what you represent. Not in the egoic sense of status, but in the symbolic sense of soul. You have become, perhaps without even realizing it, an embodiment of the self in motion, a living symbol of inner wholeness. And that carries a resonance far greater than any argument. But this path also asks for solitude, not loneliness, but a willingness to be with yourself long enough that your inner world becomes more compelling than the world's noise. Most people never reach this place. They live at the surface of things, addicted to speed, stimulation, and social confirmation. But those who walk the path Jung outlined, the path of individuation, must learn to descend, to leave behind the glitter of approval and touch the ground of the soul. And in doing so, they may find themselves walking alone for a time. This aloneness is not a punishment. It is a rite of passage. Because the deeper you go into yourself, the more distance you create from the collective masks. You no longer belong to every conversation. You no longer need to comment on every event. You no longer seek to be seen by those who have not yet seen themselves. You begin to understand that sacred things are not made for mass consumption. They are cultivated in quiet, protected by boundaries, and revealed only when the moment is right. And when that moment comes, you no longer hesitate. You speak with precision, with presence, with clarity. You have nothing to hide because you have nothing to prove. Your speech has become a mirror of your silence, measured, meaningful, and alive with presence. Others may call it wisdom. You know it as integration. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of individuation as the task of a lifetime. Not the accumulation of knowledge, but the willingness to live at depth, to face the darkness within and emerge with something worth offering the world. Not noise, not reaction, but truth born in stillness. And this truth changes everything, because the person who has mastered silence no longer fears rejection. They are not fragile in the face of critique. They do not chase attention or shrink from it. They are rooted in something unshakable, not perfection, not performance, but presence. And presence cannot be faked, it cannot be replicated. It is the fruit of 1,000 moments of listening to the voice within and learning to trust it. In a world addicted to expression, silence has become sacred. Not the silence of repression, but the silence of sovereignty. The silence that holds, contains, distills. The silence that listens to the unconscious and allows it to speak in dreams, in art, in intuition. The silence that refuses to rush, even when the world is running. The silence that remembers that becoming is not a spectacle, but a slow unfolding. This is not for everyone. It is not glamorous. It is not fast. It is not easy, but it is real. And in a time when so much is artificial, the real has power. You do not need to announce your growth. Let it speak for itself. You do not need to defend your path. Walk it. You do not need to narrate your healing. Live it. And when you do speak, let it be from the place that has learned the language of silence. That is the voice the world is starving to hear, and it will recognize you, not by how much you say, but by what your silence reveals. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.